Well, good morning. My name's Derek. I'm the assistant pastor. Ben's my boss. If there's something you like about the church, please come and tell me afterwards. If there's something you don't like, talk to Ben. That was a joke. When AJ was fixing up my microphone, he said, right, you've got new batteries in there, you're good for 1.5 hours. And I said, oh, is that all? Let's get a bit more serious. This is where I don't want to waste too much time. It was great to see the choir, didn't you think? Great to see older ladies, younger ladies taking part, praising the Lord and encouraging us. So well done all of you, whatever age. It was good to have you singing in that way. This morning we're looking at our last part of Daniel. We're in chapter 6. Daniel defies Darius's edict. Now, this includes the story of the lion's den, which is probably one of the most well-known Bible stories that there is. Daniel in the lion's den. But first of all, this King Darius appears. Talking of lions' dens, I don't know if you've been to the Wyckoff Environmental Centre. There's a park, there's a lake. They've got some enclosures with some animals in it. They haven't got any lions, but they have got one enclosure that's got a couple of bobcats. Now, what's a bobcat? Well, it's part of the lynx family, it's part of the cat family, but instead of being that big and bigger and threatening like Daniel and the lions, they're about that big. Bigger than a domestic kitty, but not as big as a lion. And one of these days I was there doing one of my little walks around there, and I always like to see the bobcats, and there was a keeper in the enclosure with them. And I thought, ooh, because I don't really know much about bobcats. We don't have bobcats wandering around in the UK. I understand there are some in New Jersey, wild, but these two are in the enclosure, and the keeper, the man, he was cleaning or feeding them or doing whatever he was doing, and the bobcats were paying absolutely no attention to him whatsoever, and he was paying no attention to them whatsoever either. They just ignored him, just like your kitty at home probably ignores you, except when it's hungry. It didn't bother him. It didn't bother them. It was okay. And that brought to mind Daniel and the lion's den. The lions, you wouldn't expect them just to sort of wander around and take no notice of Daniel, but that appears to be what happened. And that's what we're going to be looking at this morning, and also stepping back and thinking, well, we've had a few sermons on Daniel. Can we sort of wrap it up? What can we sort of learn overall? So that's where we're going this morning. We don't know what sort of an enclosure it was that the lion's den was in. It probably wasn't made of rock because there weren't caves around there, so we don't think they could have just made a cave for him. We doubt whether it was a big hole in the ground because apparently the water table there is quite high, and if you dig a hole, it'll just fill with water. It probably wasn't made of wood because there weren't many trees around there. So the chances are it was made of brick. There was lots of clay, and they made bricks. So maybe there was this brick enclosure. Why they kept the lions there, we don't know. Maybe it was for sport, for hunting, or maybe it was just to boost the king's ego so he could say, oh yeah, I got the king of the animals under my thumb. I'm the greatest. I don't know. But they had a lion's den. And this guy, Darius, comes along. Now, who is Darius? He's the new king. Very briefly, in 605, Jerusalem was attacked by the Babylonians. The king was Nebuchadnezzar. That's when Daniel and others were taken into captivity. Later, the Babylonians completely destroyed the temple in 587. Nebuchadnezzar was ruling. Then we had Belshazzar last week, and then he was killed very soon after the event that we heard about last week. And then Darius the Mede came along. We think his reign might have been combined with Cyrus, we're not too sure, but this was about 538 to 536. He wasn't there very long. And Daniel was already there, and he had an outstanding reputation. If you think about it, he is now an older man because he'd been serving Nebuchadnezzar since 605 and he's long gone. And then the other kings came along. And I want to read Daniel chapter 6. It's quite long, but I'm going to read it. You don't need to stand up. And we will see what we can find from this chapter. So this is Daniel chapter 6. Daniel defies Darius's edict. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps should give account, so that the king might suffer no loss. Then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him. And the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Then the high officials and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom. But they could find no ground for complaint or any fault, because he was faithful, and no error or fault was found in him. Then these men said, "We shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel, unless we find it in connection with the law of his God." Then these high officials and satraps came by agreement to the king and said to him, "O King Darius," or Darius, I'm not sure how we pronounce it, "live forever. All the high officials of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the counselors and the governors are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the injunction, sign the document so that it cannot be changed, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked." Therefore, King Darius, the king signed the document and injunction. When Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he had done previously. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and plea before his God. Then they came near and said before the king concerning the injunction, "O king, did you not sign an injunction that anyone who makes petition to any god or man within 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions?" The king answered, "The thing stands fast, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be revoked." Then they answered and said before the king, "Well, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or the injunction you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day." Then the king, when he heard these words, was much distressed and set his mind to deliver Daniel, and he labored till the sun went down to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, "Know, O king, that it is a law of the Medes and Persians that no injunction or ordinance that the king establishes shall be changed." Then the king commanded, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. The king declared to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you." And a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his lords, that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions brought to him, and sleep fled from him. Then at break of day, the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions. As he came near to the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, "O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions?" Then Daniel said to the king, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him, and also before you, O king. I have done no harm." Then the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. And the king commanded And those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and cast into the den of lions, they, their children, and their wives. And before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces. Then King Darius wrote to all the peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, "Peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions." So this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Whew. Long story, but it's important that we see all of it. So Daniel continues to lead this life of integrity. His outstanding qualities are obvious to everybody, and it provokes jealousy in the eyes of all these other satraps and rulers and so forth. After all, Daniel is just a Jewish exile. He's not really a true Babylonian. He's not really one of us. And here he is telling us what to do. We want to get rid of him. We can't have him over us. But we can't find any fault in his work. But what about his religion? So Darius must have been a bit of a weak character, because they tricked him. They came to him and they tricked him into issuing this decree. Now, of course, it will bolster the king's ego. Only worship you for 1 month. Everybody, we don't want people worshipping the other gods. We want them worshipping you, O king, because you are the great king. That would make him feel good, I reckon. But if he'd stopped to think that this worship of the king month was going to happen, he might have thought, what's a good reason for it? Hang on, don't we all have our own gods in this country anyway? I wonder what our so-called gods will think if they're starved of worship for a month and all our people are just worshipping Yahweh. I mean, worshipping Yahweh, the God of Daniel, is a good thing, but they believed they had all these other gods. What would they think when they're ignored for a month? They didn't think it through. They just wanted rid of Daniel. The king didn't think it through. There was no good reason for this edict. Darius didn't really consider it. He didn't consider what these other gods would think. He showed no respect for their own gods, in effect, thinking, well, it doesn't matter if we don't worship them for a month. We'll come back to them later. They're not so important. But no, it didn't work like that. So the story unfolds. Daniel, as we said, distinguished himself. He, if you like, exhibited some of the fruit of the Spirit. Although the Holy Spirit didn't dwell in him in the same way that the Holy Spirit dwells within us, he was showing the characteristics of God, the fruit of the Spirit in his life. And then these guys came along and said, we have all agreed that you should issue this edict, O king. All of them? Where were Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Were they still around? We don't know. Daniel certainly wasn't party to this agreement. But they came to the king and he believed them. But when Daniel heard this, what did he do? Business as usual. He was in the habit of praying 3 times a day, and he continued that habit unchanged. But the law of the Medes and the Persians cannot be changed. And once an edict is established, it has to stand for all time. You cannot just ignore it. So the king was in a bit of a bind. He'd been tricked. He'd been duped. And he couldn't get out of it. So Daniel ends up in the den. The mouth of the lions are shut. Then the king comes along in the morning, as we just read, finds out what happened, and then all the other officials reach a sticky end, and so did their families. It was brutal. It was like that then. Life was cheap. They were all thrown into the lion's den. And then Darius issues this decree ordering everybody to fear and reverence Yahweh, Daniel's God. God is glorified. Daniel is released. Daniel is saved. So that's the essence of the story. Let's see if we can step back to review this a little bit and look at Daniel in the bigger picture, the context, the life in Judah before the Babylonian attack. I'm going to read a portion from Jeremiah. It won't be on the screen, but it's interesting. One thing you might find interesting when you get home is to go onto the internet and just trace out where these prophets were, because we dip into Daniel, we dip into this prophet, we dip into that other prophet, but they're all linked together. Were they prophesying at the same time? Were they before? Were they after? And it's fascinating. Jeremiah was around at the same time as Daniel. And so are other prophets. Check it out. You can see these charts on the internet. But in Jeremiah 25, Jeremiah is prophesying before Daniel and his friends are carted off to Babylon. The word that came to Jeremiah concerning all the people of Judah in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah. That was the 1st year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, which Jeremiah the prophet spoke to all the people in Judah and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem. So this is just the introduction. This is Jeremiah saying, right, this is this place. We've got Jehoiakim is our king. Nebuchadnezzar is just getting into Babylon. And here comes a prophecy from Jeremiah about these people, the Jews. For 23 years, from the 13th year of Josiah, the son of Ammon, king of Judah, to this day, the word of the Lord has come to me, and I've spoken persistently to you, but you have not listened. You have neither listened nor inclined your ears to hear, although the Lord persistently sent to you all his servants the prophets, saying, turn now, every one of you, from his evil way and evil deeds, and dwell upon the land that the Lord has given to you and your fathers from of old and forever. Do not go after other gods to serve and worship them, or provoke me to anger with the work of your hands. Then I will do you no harm. Yet you have not listened to me, declares the Lord, that you might provoke me to anger with the work of your hands to your own harm. This is God prophesying not to the Babylonians, but to the Jews, his own people. Therefore, thus says the Lord of hosts, because you have not obeyed my words, behold, I will send for all the tribes of the north, declares the Lord, and for Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant. Nebuchadnezzar, God's servant? That's what it says. And through the weeks, we've seen Nebuchadnezzar blowing hot and cold in terms of his devotion to God. But here is God calling Nebuchadnezzar his servant. And I will bring them against this land and its inhabitants, and against all these surrounding nations. I will devote them to destruction and make them a horror, a hissing, and an everlasting desolation. Moreover, I will banish from them the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride, the grinding of the millstones and the light of the lamp. This whole land shall become a ruin and a waste, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon for 70 years. That's the context that Daniel is in. They've been carted off to Babylon. God's people have been unfaithful, and God uses Nebuchadnezzar, whatever his heart is like. God has used Nebuchadnezzar to be an act of God's judgment. Daniel spent just about all his adult life in exile. He had, in other words, most of his life, remember we were saying the other week, and we know that he was carted off to Babylon when he was a teenager. Now he's in his 70s or 80s. And I remember Pastor Ben was saying we need the 80s. People with maturity, people with wisdom. I can't put my hand up and say, I'll come, I'll be that. But give me a few years and I will. Not that many either. Daniel lived all his adult life in captivity, in exile. Okay, he had important jobs, but his life was a bit like a roller coaster, as we got as a title there. He spent all his adult life there. But he didn't allow these adverse circumstances to overwhelm or define him. He did not allow the adverse circumstances to overwhelm him. It would have been easy for him just to have given up and got depressed and just hated where he was. But no, he got involved. I don't think he had much choice in that. and he did a good job. He practiced his faith in a hostile environment despite the likely outcome. He had a life of integrity and truth, a bit like the fruit of the Spirit being emphasized in his life. Interesting thing is that he did earn respect from the Babylonian and the Medes and Persian kings. Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar and Darius, they had a respect for him because he could do these things like interpret dreams and have dreams that relate to them. So they knew he had something. They respected him even if they didn't like his religion. He was hated by his Babylonian contemporaries. He was an outsider. He was an exile. Today we would say he suffered racism or racial discrimination. But he was definitely an outsider as far as the satraps and the governors and the rulers are concerned. But he boldly proclaimed God's judgment on the kings, despite the fact that it was a risky occupation, and he was gifted by God to have an impact on those around him. He could interpret dreams. He had this gift given on specific occasions for specific purposes. One minute Daniel is advising the king, saying, well, king, you've had a dream. This is what it means. You should do that. And the king says, all right, thank you, Daniel. I'll promote you. Thank you for helping me. The next minute, he's thrown into the lion's den. And he suffered other threats as well. Good times and bad times. Being honoured, being threatened. He had to cope with both adulation and rejection. He had to cope with both fulfillment and fear. He had both good times and bad times. Same as us. And really, that last song that we sang, Blessed be the name of the Lord, did you notice when we're saying, Blessed be the name of the Lord when everything's going well? But what about when there's pain in the offering? Blessed be the Lord. And we were singing, whatever happens, we're going to bless the Lord because he's worthy of all our praise and honour and glory. And that song really is putting that into words. Daniel's experience was that because he was faithful to God, he was rescued from trouble. Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego had the same experience. They weren't thrown into a lion's den, but if you remember, they were thrown into the fiery furnace. They weren't harmed. So these faithful guys back then were rescued by God. The lion's den, the fiery furnace. If they were faithful, they were okay. If they were faithless, the whole people of Judah were taken into captivity. But things don't always work out like that. It's not always that if we're faithful, we're okay, and if we drift from God, he will condemn us. It's not like that. It's not as simple as that. What about John the Baptist? What happened to him? If you remember, he was beheaded. What happened to Stephen? If you remember, he was stoned to death for preaching the gospel. Sometimes, and this is uncomfortable, sometimes God does not deliver us. He delivered Daniel. He delivered Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. He did not deliver John the Baptist from an early death. He did not deliver Stephen from an early death. But these guys are doing fruitful stuff for the kingdom. How on earth should God let that happen? That God slipped up? God didn't rescue them. Why not? You know, our faith needs to be able to encompass loss and tragedy and failure, as well as success, as well as protection, as well as blessing. This is difficult because when we see Daniel, we see the guy that God protected from harm. And then we look at John the Baptist, we look at Stephen, and we look at some of the apostles, and right up to this current day, we see people who are killed for their faith. Why? What's God up to? Why doesn't he protect us? Why doesn't he bless us? Very difficult. So there's two questions I want us to ask and think about for a minute. First, what do we need when things are going well? This is when Daniel is ruling the kingdom or third in the kingdom, and he's got good structures going, he's well thought of, and things are going really well. And God's delivered him. Well, one of the most important things that I believe that we need, Pastor Ben spoke about last week, humility. When things are going well, we need humility. Because if we get proud, things can easily go wrong. We need restraint. We need to keep focus. We need to beware distractions. We need to hold lightly our lives and our involvements. We need to not to grip onto status, achievement, thinking that it's something that's permanent. It may not be. When things are going well, the chances are that there's a measure of fragility and vulnerability there. Success is often very fragile. We need to beware complacency. When I worked in the UK for a few years, I was involved in something to do with school management and school boards, and it's the nearest equivalent. And on 2 occasions, there were 2 schools. One was what you call an elementary school. We call it a primary school in England. The other was a secondary school. We'd call it a high school. They were both high-performing schools. They were both schools that were doing well. And they had a reputation of doing well. They had a reputation of successful leadership. Things in both those schools, completely separately, went downhill because those at the top allowed themselves to get complacent and started dipping their hands into the till. Things went wrong. Corruption. These were not struggling schools that were really battling against the odds. These were successful schools, and the leaders started looking where they shouldn't be looking, and that had to be sorted out. But it's not just schools where it happens. It happened in the Bible. 2 Samuel 11 verses 1 to 4. David, King David. In the spring of the year, this was time when everything was going well for David. The kingdom was at peace. Things were, things were going okay. So in the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel. And they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. But David remained at Jerusalem. It happened late one afternoon, when David arose from his couch and was walking on the roof of the king's house, that he saw from the roof a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful. And David sent and inquired about the woman, and one said, "Is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" So David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. This was in a time of success for David. Things were going well. But notice at the beginning, it says, when kings go out to war. King? Who's the king? David. Oh, Joab, can you go? You can manage this just as better than me. You go. I'll stay at home. I'll pass on this one. David was falling down on the job. It was his job. It was the kings went out to war at that time of year. It was the habit. It was the way things worked. He should have gone, but no. He was complacent. He was tired, probably. Joab, you look after it. You're fine. David was left in Jerusalem. Goes for a walk on the roof. He's got nothing better to do than just wander around. His kingdom's okay. And we know the story. Times of achievement can so easily become times of failure. So if things are going well, what we need to know is that success is very fragile and vulnerable, and we need to be very focused and very careful. Well, this is to do with church, job, family, whatever it may be. Hold it lightly and be careful. What about things when things are not going so well? When there's pain in the offering, as we were singing earlier on. Good doesn't always triumph. It's easy for us to say, well, trust God, or it's God's will, or something like that. It's not so easy to live in it in the midst of loss or pain. And when we say, well, it must be God's will, what are we saying? Is sin God's will? Is sickness God's will? Is violence God's will? Is he responsible for crime, abuse, hate, evil? What does it mean that God is sovereign? These are difficult questions. Stuff happens that God never intended, yet yes, he is still sovereign. He is not powerless. He knows. He cares. He comes alongside. He can bring good out of bad circumstances. He doesn't always step in to prevent evil. That's hard. He doesn't always step in to prevent evil. He could do, but he chooses not to for good reason. Stuff happens that God never intended. Yet he's still sovereign. He's not powerless. He knows. He can bring good. Yet, despite his not always acting in a way that we might like him to, he is good and gracious. Daniel's success and fulfillment arose from lifelong adversity, living in exile with restricted freedom. In other words, it wasn't all pleasurable for Daniel. He had a whole lifetime, virtually, where he did not want to be. Things don't always go well. Now, we can't answer these questions fully. At least if you know the answer to the question of suffering and God's will, you come and tell me afterwards, because I don't fully understand it. But I do understand some of Psalm 23. And I want to read it because it addresses both when things are going well and when things are not going well. This is probably the best known psalm, isn't it? The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For you are with me. Your rod and staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Wow. That's a good psalm to read every day. It's a good psalm because it addresses when things are going well. Sometimes he helps us to lie down in green pastures. He leads us beside still waters. Yes, sometimes everything is as it should be and everything is peaceful. But then the psalmist doesn't stop there, because he goes on to then say, well, it's not always like that. And it doesn't mean you sinned. It doesn't mean you've done something wrong. We're in a fallen world. He says that he restores our souls. What does that mean? Why would your soul need restoring? Why would your heart need God's restoration, renewal work? Well, because things are not going very well. Things are tough, things are hard, things are painful. There's grief, there's loss, there's sorrow, there's heartache, there's tragedy, there's disaster. There's things which we would never want to wish upon ourselves. But God says, yeah, I know, but I can restore your soul when it's wounded. Now, this is a good doctrine. But I can tell you, it's not just a good doctrine. I can tell you from personal experience, it works. God restores souls. When we are weakened, when we are damaged, when we are wounded, and life is going to wound us probably at some time with something, God will help restore your soul if you are with him, if you're close to him. It talks about walking through pain, the valley of the shadow of death. But God is very much present, not just doctrine. I've known that from personal experience. Sometimes there's times of peace and renewal alongside the pain. And that's good. God is there with us just as much. He somehow enables us to celebrate the abundance of his goodness despite the enemies being around. You spread a table before my enemies. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. In other words, there's still things around. Metaphorically, what is an enemy? Well, it's something that's a real pain to you. It's a real burden. It may be loss. It may be tragedy. It may be grief. God can help you to celebrate, not because of that, but despite that and in that. We have the promise of God's unchanging presence and goodness. I suppose these days you might say, well, God has got my 6. You know that expression that you get in all these sort of crime thriller programs. God's got all these espionage programs. God's got my six. In other words, wherever I am, who's following along behind me? God is. God is. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. And then that fantastic final promise, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. We ain't seen nothing yet. We had that title the other week. So this speaks of restoration in adversity. It speaks of walking through pain with God very much present. It speaks of times of peace and renewal alongside pain. It speaks of celebration and abundance despite the enemies being around. It speaks of the promise of God's unchanging presence of goodness, and it speaks of ultimate eternal joy. Wow, no wonder the first line is, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. It's all there. God will provide all that we need for this life when it's easy and when things are going well, but especially when it's hard and it's difficult, and it's not that we've done something wrong, but life has just thrown something at us. God is going to be there with us. Now, I cannot answer fully the question, why does God allow this and not that? Why did he save Daniel? Why did he save Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? But he didn't save Joseph from being wrongly imprisoned. He didn't save John the Baptist from being beheaded. He didn't save Stephen from being stoned. I don't know. I don't have the answer to that. And as I say, if you do, come and tell me afterwards. We do not understand fully God. The question is not so much why, but can I trust God in this? Can I trust God? There is no totally satisfactory answer. We live in a fallen world and stuff happens. But God is in this business of renewal and restoration. He's in the business of giving hope where there is none, of giving strength to tackle adversity. We may not have the same challenges as Daniel, but God remains the same, and his promises stand for all time. So when things are easy, bless the Lord. When it's hard and there's pain in the offering, as we just sang, blessed be the name of the Lord. God is good, and he is with us. Amen.